Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session in American English Live Teacher Development Series 7. My name is Lauren, and I'll be with you today along with my colleague behind the scenes, Heather, who will be serving as moderator to help answer your questions and respond to your comments during the session. Today, our host, Kate, will be talking with our presenter, Joe McVeigh, about methods for identifying student needs when considering course design and development. So let's get started.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so happy to have each and every one of you here. It's great to see all of our regulars, all of the familiar names that we see often in the chat box and in the comments. We're happy to have you here again. And of course, to our first-time viewers, we want to extend a warm, warm welcome. So thanks for being here, everybody. Let's begin today with these fantastic photos featuring teachers from viewing groups in Chihuahua, Mexico, and Lima, Peru during our last webinar. We love to see our teacher participants actively engaged in professional development. So please share your photos from AE Live sessions by emailing them to americanenglishwebinars@fhi360.org or by sharing them on social media. If you share on social media, be sure to tag us at American English for Educators so that we can find your photos and share them during the next session. Today is our fourth session in American English Live Teacher Development Series 7. We have an exciting lineup of topics remaining related to curriculum and course design and learning through professional networks and communities of practice. Which sessions are you most excited about? Share your responses in the chat, and we hope that you're able to use all of the great practical ideas that we're sharing throughout the series in your classrooms. So here's what to expect today. Each session is about 60 minutes long and is often related to an American English e-teacher massive open online course or a Teacher's Corner theme on the American English website. The presenter will present the material, and I, as your host, will ask questions and make comments as well. But we really hope to hear from you, our audience, so that we can address your ideas, concerns, questions, comments, and experiences. Please do share your thoughts using the comments feature or the chat box. And when our session comes to a close in about an hour, you will have an opportunity to receive your digital badge for participating. At the end of the session, we'll share a link which will have 3 questions. Answer 2 out of 3 of those questions correctly to be eligible, and within about a week, you should receive your digital badge via email from badger@badger.io. We'll share some ideas for storing and sharing your virtual or digital badges at the end of this session. And finally, before we begin, we would like to invite you to register for our current free self-paced massive open online course, or MOOC, using educational technology. With support from our global education partners, this MOOC will enable TESOL professionals like you to increase your awareness of free technological tools, to learn how to use these tools for language learning and teaching, and to evaluate the appropriateness of each tool for your specific context. This course is now live and it will be open from February 10th to May 4th. You can log in and participate and complete all of the coursework at any time in that window, but it must all be completed by May 4th, and it's designed to be a 5-week course, so keep that in mind. So visit the link here for more details, and we hope to see many of you there. And now for today's session, Needs Assessment for Course or Curriculum Design. In this webinar, we will first examine the needs assessment process by reviewing several methods, techniques, and options for gathering data about student needs. We will then consider how to use that information for course design, examining some basic course development steps and choices. We'll also briefly explore how needs assessment principles for course design can translate to the larger task of curriculum development. You'll gain a clear sense of design choices and decision points to consider, and you'll receive tools and ideas to help ensure that courses and curricula meet your students' needs. And now we're pleased to introduce our presenter, Joe McVeigh. Joe lives in the beautiful state of Vermont in the northeastern United States He has taught English as a second or foreign language for students, and he's also trained teachers at colleges and universities in the United States and overseas. And he's the author of several textbooks for students. Joe serves on the board of directors of the TESOL International Association and also works as a consultant, advising schools on English language needs and giving professional development workshops and conference talks. He's worked as an English language specialist for the US Department of State in Oman, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Spain, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So welcome, Joe. We're very happy to have you here with us today.
Well, thank you, Kate. I'm very happy to be here as well, and to welcome those who are watching from all over the world, especially those with our regional English language officers and their assistants and others in embassies and consulates. It's really tremendous that teachers can gather together using these electronic means and develop communities of practice to help each other learn. So I'm delighted that you're all here and excited to talk with you about needs assessment for course or curriculum design. But before I plunge into that, Kate, I had a question for you. I think maybe some of our viewers might be wondering, when I look at you on the camera there, I see to the side of your head a large apple.
Yes.
What is that apple?
Yeah, well, as you guys can all see, we have a new lovely banner, which has our American English for Educators logo on it. And we're very happy to have it here today. But the reason why we have an apple on our American English for Educators logo is that here in the United States, it's sort of a cultural tradition that you give an apple to teachers to show your appreciation. So something that you might do, especially in elementary school, is to bring an apple and put it on your student's desk. So we often associate apples with teachers here in the United States.
So you'd put the apple on the teacher's desk. Well, if I do a good job today, Kate, maybe you'll give me an apple when we're done.
Good. Sounds good.
Well, let's start out today by looking at a roadmap, which is kind of an outline of what we'll be talking about. The first thing we're going to do is to ask the question, what is needs assessment? Then we want to think about how we can gather information. After that, we'll look at how we can use that information to design courses. And finally, we'll look at the question of how needs assessment can support curriculum design or perhaps adapting or tailoring an existing course. But as we're getting started, I'd like you to think a little bit about the context in which you work or teach, because we have hundreds of English language teachers with us today. And while you might be teaching in an elementary school or a secondary school or a college or university, maybe there's other people who are teaching in different situations. Maybe you teach general English, perhaps others teach highly specialized English. You probably have different degrees of support and technology available to you, and perhaps some of you are even involved in the training of teachers and professional development programs. So as I'm talking with you today, I want you to think about what I'm saying and think about how it can be adapted to your own particular situation. I might give you some examples that don't exactly fit what you're doing, but think about how it might work in your situation. Now, when it comes to course design, I suspect that some of you might be in a situation where you teach your own class and the course and the syllabus and the materials are all already selected for you. You don't have much choice in the matter. But then maybe some of you teach a class, but you do have the opportunity to choose your own materials and maybe some of the course content. Others might be responsible for developing and designing a new course altogether. And perhaps there are a handful of you who are responsible for developing and designing the curriculum for an entire school or program. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today really applies to those people in category C who are creating a course and developing it and designing it. So if that's not what you're doing right now, maybe you will be doing that in a few years. So I hope these ideas will be helpful and you can think about how they would work in your own situation or context. So to touch again on our roadmap, the first question that we want to answer today is, what is needs assessment? So let me give you a definition of needs assessment. This comes from an excellent book by H. Douglas Brown called The Elements of Language Curriculum. And here's Brown's definition. He says, needs assessment is the systematic collection and analysis of all subjective and objective information necessary to define and validate defensible curriculum purposes that satisfy the language learning requirements of students within the context of particular institutions that influence the learning and teaching situation. How do you like that definition, Kate?
Well, it sounds very intellectual, but it's a little confusing for me.
You know, it is a little bit academic. So to think about how we might go about needs design for a course, let's first take a different situation. I'd like you to imagine that you need to lead a group of people on a hike to climb a mountain. So if you were in charge of that, what would you want to know in advance to help plan the trip?
All right, that's a great question. What do you think, everybody? Imagine that you are going to lead a group of people on a hike to climb a mountain. What types of questions would you ask yourself to sort of think about how you're going to plan for this trip? What would you want to know in advance? What do you think, everyone? Let's see. A lot of people saying they want to know the physical fitness of the group. Let's see, Talia says she wants to know what the weather would be like. Anna also says what the weather would be. Let's see, what else? Let's see, we're seeing some folks who say, how high is the mountain? How many people are coming? Age and number of people. How much money? Maybe there's an entrance fee or something like that. What's the degree of difficulty? What sort of tools or equipment or supplies are you going to need to bring? So yeah, lots of great answers, everybody. Thanks for sharing.
Those are terrific ideas. And many of those are quite similar to what I thought about what I would want to know before leading a hike. I thought, you know, how far do we have to go? How much time do we have to get there? What level of experience do the hikers have? Does everyone have the needed equipment? The weather was a question for me too. And depending on how long the hike might be, one might need food or water or to spend the night and so on. So great questions, everybody. Now, let's move back to the question of designing a course and ask this question. Imagine that you're going to design and develop a new course. What would you want to know in advance to help you develop the course? So this is really the same question about the hike, but now we're thinking about designing a class or a course.
Yeah, definitely. So what do you think, everybody? So we've thought about the activity of climbing the mountain with a group of people. Now we're focusing on designing and developing a new course. What are some of the questions that you might ask yourself or others in order to develop this course? Let's see, the target group and the objectives from Miriam, the level of students and the purpose of the course from Talia, great. Jenny says, what's the end goal of the course? Let's see, how long is the course from Sylvia? Great, previous knowledge, the students' previous knowledge is some nice comment from Andrea. And what do the students need? What is the aim of the course and what are the students' needs? Wonderful, excellent answers, everybody, thanks.
These are absolutely terrific. And it's very similar to what I was thinking about, what I would want to know before designing a course. And some of the things that were on my list were, you know, who are the students? What's their current level of English? How much time do we have to teach this class? What language skills do the students need to have by the end of the course? What's the educational context or situation? If we do need new materials, who would design them? And we also want to think about assessment and maybe some ways in which the entire process might be constrained, or there might be some restrictions or difficulties about how we would put it all together. But I think that our illustration of thinking about the hike and then also thinking about these questions that we would want to know help us come to a simpler definition of needs assessment. So here's one I think that's a little bit easier. Needs assessment is figuring out what you need to teach and how you can effectively teach it. And that's what we want to talk about today, is what would be the process of figuring out what you need to teach and how you can effectively teach it. So looking again at our roadmap, we started off by asking the question, what is needs assessment? And the next step is this: how can we gather information to answer those questions? So to think about how we can gather information, I'd like to look at a model of the needs assessment process. And this model was put together by author Kathleen Graves, and she suggests that the needs assessment process can be divided into 5 basic parts. So the first thing to do is to involve the right people in getting the information. Secondly, once you have those people, you want to pose or ask them the right questions. In order to ask those questions, you want to use the right instruments. And by instruments here, we mean methods or techniques to get at the information. Once we have that information, then we want to analyze and interpret the data, and then we'll be ready to go ahead and construct the course. So the first question is about involving the right people. So let me ask you this: who are some of the people that you might want to involve in a needs assessment activity?
Yeah, great question. And as we are getting our responses for that, we have one question from Edwin who says, is needs assessment the same as needs analysis?
Oh, that's a good question. Some people use the term needs assessment, and the word assessment makes you think about maybe testing. And some people use the words needs analysis, which makes you think about what you're going to do with that data afterwards. I think those two things are really the same. It's really the same process: needs assessment, needs analysis. You can use those expressions interchangeably.
All right, great. All right, so we have some great responses to this question. Who are some of the people that you might want to involve in a needs assessment activity? So let's see. Shadin says the students, so you want to hear from them. Yerinet also says the students and other teachers in your building. Walla says teachers and supervisors and students at your school. Sylvia also says teachers and students. A lot of people saying teachers and students. Miriam says the target group, so maybe the particular group of students you're aiming at, aiming this course at or for. And Lamia says maybe some ideas about what are some strengths and weaknesses in other courses that are maybe come before and after this course. So really nice responses, everybody.
Great. Well, I think that when we talk about involving the right people in the process, we can kind of divide those people into some different groups. So first off, we might think about talking with the learners or the students. Those are the people who will be taking the course or training, and they might have some ideas or thoughts about what their needs are. We also need to think about the needs analysts, who are the people who are responsible for conducting the needs analysis. Those could be teachers, course designers, consultants, materials writers. And we want to bear in mind as we're talking about this process that there might be some people involved in a big project with a lot of people involved, but you could be doing needs analysis all by yourself for a course that you're going to be teaching. So maybe you're the person who is going to do the needs analysis, and you're the person who's going to write the materials, and you're the person who's going to implement it. And in that case, you don't need to be quite so particular about things. Another group is the audience. The audience are the people who are going to act upon the analysis or make decisions after they get that information. And again, that would be teachers, possibly supervisors, managers, or administrators. And there's one other group which I'd call a resource groups. And those are people who might not be directly connected with instruction. They wouldn't be the students, they wouldn't be the teachers, but they might be able to give you some useful information. So those might be parents, maybe the financial sponsors, maybe somebody's going to be paying for this, employers, people who might be teaching this in the future, or clients or customers. Now, Kate, I'm going to ask a question. If I say in the context of English language teaching the words ESP, what does that mean to you, ESP?
Let's see, usually ESP for English language teachers is referring to English for specific purposes, I think.
That's right. And I'd like to give you a real life example of involving the right people from and ESP, or English for Specific Purposes context. So English for Specific Purposes are often courses that are taught for people who in specific professions. So for example, maybe somebody has the job of working at the front desk of a hotel. What language would they need to do that job? Maybe somebody is working as an engineer out in the field. What is the language and expressions that they would need to do that job? So that's why we use the term specific, very, very particular. And I was doing a needs analysis for a telephone calling center in a large company. And this company was trying to train people so that they could speak clearly and interact on the telephone. So here's how the involving the right people looked in that context. So here's an example of how that would work in the telephone calling center. So the learners were call center trainees. They were people who were in training to be call center agents. The needs analysis were internal and external consultants. I was one of the external consultants, and there was a training staff involved. The audience, or the people who were going to have to act on this, were some senior executives, the training department, the consultants, and a materials development team who was going to have to write the materials. Then our resource groups were managers and supervisors, some trainers, some current employees who'd already been through the training, some clients, and also some of the human resources personnel. So that's an example of involving the right people. So going back to the big picture of the needs assessment process, the first step was to involve the right people. And the next thing that we want to do is to pose the right questions. And when we're trying to pose the questions, we can think of them in different categories. The first one would be that of outcomes. So some questions that we might want to ask would be, what's the desired outcome of the course or training? In other words, what do the students or trainees need to be able to do at the conclusion of the course? Kate, does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, it sounds something like backwards design, I think.
Exactly. This is something that's been talked about in earlier American English Live webinars, backwards design, which is the idea that we start at the end. We say, this is where we want the students to be at the end of the course. And then we think about what do we need to do in order to get them to that end point. So we kind of start at the end and work backwards design. So we might also want to think about what kinds of language skills they need maybe in a particular setting or particular language functions. Well, the next type of question that we might want to pose relates to the student's language ability. What is the current ability or the current language level of students who will enter the course? Well, one way that we might think about this, as you'll see in our next slide, is a series of levels from which are sometimes called the CEFR or the CEFR, which stands for the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. And this is a commonly agreed upon scale that goes from very, very beginning low-level learners at the A1 level all the way up to quite proficient learners at the C2 level. It's one way to delineate the level of language learning. And I think we have in the chat box some resources if you'd like to look into that and learn a little bit more about it. So obviously we need to know where our students are in terms of language as we're thinking about where we want to move them. So another kind of question that we might want to pose would have to do with resources and constraints. Well, what do I mean by resources? By resources, I mean, what things do you have available that would be helpful? What do you need to consider that you have that would help you in putting a workshop or a course together? So if you wanted to create a workshop series for local teachers, what might be some resources that you would use to do that?
Great question. So, and we have some nice questions from our audience too, Joe, while we're waiting for the responses from our participants. So Jenny Ordonis is asking, is it possible to do the needs assessment on a smaller scale? For example, I just need to figure out what to teach a small group for a pretty short time.
Absolutely. I think what we're talking about here is a relatively involved process, but almost everything that we're talking about today, you can simplify and do it on a much, much smaller scale. You can even do it in a way that would work for your own class and ask questions of your students. You can think about how it would work for you. So yeah, you don't need to do it to do a really, really large needs analysis. You can do it in a much smaller way. Yes.
Great. And then just some nice comments, like one nice comment from Deanna who says, we should always start with the end goal in mind. She agrees with you.
Uh-huh.
So some tools or resources that you can use to create a workshop. Let's see, Patricio says the environment. So you want to make sure that you're using a nice environment, and you want to look into what kind of classroom or space you might need. You would use the internet and good materials from Haved. Assessment checklists and rubrics from Farida. Let's see, Janita says you could use recycled materials and also technology and the internet. And Ladavi says internet access, books, projectors, videos. Talia says PowerPoints or worksheets. So yeah, lots of great resources.
Well, that's terrific. And I think we want to think about resources. We might also want to think about a related question, which would be, what would be the constraints or potential problems or restrictions that might make it more of a challenge to put that workshop together? Well, let's go ahead and look at the answers that I thought about for these two questions about, first of all, what resources would be available to make this happen? And then secondly, what are the constraints? So as you can see in more detail on the next slide, I thought of some of the same things that you did about resources. Who are the people who are going to make this happen? Do we have space to teach it? Do we need a classroom, or are we going to need maybe to rent some space to have room to do this? Do we have the money to pay people to do it? Or is there another way to get the money that we might need? And are there possible technological solutions as well? But we also want to think a little bit about constraints. And constraints are, as has been pointed out in the chat, this is a great definition, a constraint is a challenge or a roadblock or an obstacle that might prevent you from achieving a goal or objectives. And the interesting thing is that some of the same things which might be resources can also sometimes be constraints. So for example, money. Maybe you have a great idea, but there's not enough money to pay somebody to develop that. Another difficulty is time. Often people want something to happen very, very quickly. You don't have the time that you need to put it together. And then of course, human resources and personnel, which is another way of saying people. Do you have the people who can do that? Let's look at one other way in which we might pose the right question. And that's a little bit different. I'm using the expression here, under the surface. And the question is this: is the problem being presented to you really the problem? Or is maybe the real problem something else or something in addition? So let me give you another real life example of how I encountered this. In my example, which again is at the telephone calling center, and I'm going to refer back to this from time to time during today's talk, the presenting problem, the problem that we were told about was, it's a matter of pronunciation. The problem that these learners have is that their pronunciation isn't very good. But when we did the needs assessment, it showed us that yes, pronunciation was a difficulty, but there were also some other issues: grammar, using popular expressions, cultural awareness, and speaking with appropriate levels of politeness. These were other things that the learners needed. And if we had listened only to what we were told, you know, the problem is pronunciation, and we only asked questions about pronunciation, we would never have gotten to these other areas. So just, if you're put in a position where some person is asking you to look into something, make sure that you go a little bit deeper so that you're really getting to the root of the problem or the issues. So these are all different kinds of questions that we might pose. And let's look at some examples of some of the questions that we might want to ask. We talked about the level of students' English and what aspects of that language might need improvement. Time is always a factor. How much teaching time is available before they need to be at the next level? What type of language do the students need to use in their education or work? What about the teachers? How much experience do they have? Is it going to be necessary to provide more training for teachers? And then there's also the question of materials. What materials would be the most helpful? So as we go back and look again at our overview of the needs assessment process, we started off by trying to involve the right people. We've just been talking about posing the right questions, and now we're going to go on and look at the question of using the right instruments. And by instruments here again, I don't mean musical instruments, but maybe a method, a technique, some means or way of getting some information. So here's the question. What instruments, methods, or techniques can you use to answer key questions related to your needs assessment?
All right, great question. What do you think, everyone? What types of methods, techniques, strategies, tools would you use to answer those needs assessment questions that we've been talking about and identifying? Let's see, Talia says surveys, great. What else? What other types of tools would you use? Questionnaires we're seeing from a lot of participants, great. Others who are saying interviews. Marisol says interviews and observations. Veronica says asking for students to give feedback. Online surveys from Lourdes. Let's see, Google Forms, surveys. Proficiency exams from Anna, very nice. And maybe recordings of classes from Deanna, that's a great idea. And then you could take some notes on maybe a video of a class or something.
Yeah, I think that.
Oh, sorry, one more, just that you can get information from other English teachers from Adrienne. So great ideas, everybody. Absolutely.
Yes, well, thank you everyone for those ideas. Here are some of the instruments that I was thinking about. And someone pointed this out, which is great. You know, there's often already some existing information. We rarely start from absolute zero. Usually there's some information out there. Sometimes it's test results or other teachers who've already taught the subject and so on. So a good place to start is with existing information. Of course, we want also to think about tests, and there are different ways that we might use tests or assessment instruments, especially for gauging student levels of English ability. Then a few other methods are interviews and focus groups, questionnaires, observations, and discourse analysis. Let's look a little bit closer at using interviews and focus groups. Kate, what do you think is the difference between an interview and a focus group?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think usually of an interview as more one-on-one, or maybe one person asking two people questions. But with a focus group, I think more of a group of people, maybe they all have something in common. And then you ask them focused questions and have sort of a pinpointed conversation around a specific topic.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We usually think of an interview as being with quite a small group of people. Sometimes it's one-on-one, could be two, could be three. And a focus group is a larger group that usually you've asked to come together specifically to help you for this purpose. So when you're doing interviews or focus groups, you want people to feel comfortable. You don't want them to be nervous. Food is often very helpful in this regard. You want to explain to them why you're doing this. What's the purpose of the needs assessment? And make sure that they get to do most of the talking. One useful technique is to repeat back to people what they've said to you to make sure that you understand it. Sometimes, as you know, as classroom teachers in the classroom, we have some students who are very talkative and others who say very little. And that can often be the same in a group like this. So you want to try to encourage the quieter people to talk more and maybe get the more talkative people to dial it back a little bit. Sometimes someone will say something and you can get more information if you ask some follow-up questions. So don't just ask a question, get an answer, ask a question, get an answer. After you get the answer, maybe ask a little deeper and see what more you can find out. It's quite difficult to lead a discussion and also be taking notes on the discussion. So if you can, if you've got somebody else who could be doing that for you and taking notes, that's a good idea. And then finally, I think it's nice to tell people what you're going to do with the results of the interview. Sometimes when people have had the opportunity to give input into a process, they think that their input is the same as the final decision. They think that because they told you something, you're definitely going to do that, and maybe you're not. So I think it's always good to be careful not to create an expectation on people's parts that because they talk to you, you're going to do things the way they said. You need to make it clear that you're looking at a variety of different sources of information and their input is just one part of it. Let's look at a different way of obtaining information, a different instrument. That would be questionnaires or surveys, which several of you mentioned in the chat. You want to be careful in a questionnaire that you keep those questions carefully focused and that your questionnaire isn't too long. These days, often people are asked to complete these in an online format or on computers. And when you get the questionnaire and it goes on and on and on and on, a lot of people just give up and they won't answer all those questions. So try to keep it fairly short and then think about how you're going to collect and use that information. What is the information going to be? And how are you going to incorporate that? It's a good idea to pilot a questionnaire, which means when we say pilot, we mean ask just 2 or 3 people to fill out the questionnaire and see if the answers are what you think they're going to be. Sometimes people understand those questions a little bit differently than you think they might. You could also consider making your questionnaire anonymous, which means that people would answer without giving their names. Sometimes people are a little bit more talkative and a little bit more honest if their ideas are not attached to their names. Well, another instrument that we can use in addition to questionnaires is observations. And observations, as you know, because you've probably been observed or observed other teachers, usually involves going into a classroom and watching what someone is doing. So we can think about observations in terms of classrooms, but we could also think about observations in different settings. For example, in a workplace, where are students going to be learning the English afterwards, and what are they going to need to be able to do? So for example, if you were preparing students to do university work in English, it might be worthwhile visiting the classes that those students are going to have to take after they've completed the language program to find out what kinds of language they're going to need to use. And whenever and wherever you do an observation, you want to try to be a fly on the wall. And what I mean by that is you don't want to disrupt the class or the situation. You want to be as quiet as you can and just kind of out of the way so that the interaction will take place the way it normally would if you weren't there. Well, let me give you an interesting example of an observation. And this again comes from the telephone calling center experience. And the way that we tried observing what was going on was by listening in on live telephone calls. So there'd be an agent and there'd be a customer or a client, and they would be talking on the phone, and I'd put on some headphones and listen in to their phone call. Now remember that the presenting problem, what we were told going in for the needs assessment, was that the problem was a matter of pronunciation. But by listening carefully to those calls, and especially by seeing where the communication broke down or was not successful, the observation showed that, yes, again, pronunciation was an issue, but there was something else. And one of those issues was that call center agents needed to have better skills at conveying nonverbal behavior through stress and intonation. It turns out that stress and intonation are very important when you can't see the person in particular. Now, the last method or instrument that I'd like to talk about today is something that we call discourse analysis. When you do discourse analysis, you collect language samples that students will need to understand or produce. This could be in writing or it could be spoken. And then you look carefully at the language that's used. What do you notice about that language? So if we think back to what we were talking about before about preparing students for a university level program conducted in English, you might want to go and visit that university setting and look at the textbooks that the students would have to read. Or perhaps you'd want to listen or maybe record some of the lectures or see what kind of writing they would have to do. So those would all be ways of doing discourse analysis. Now, I'd like you to look at a sample of discourse analysis. And here's what I'd like you to do. Listen carefully to the following conversation. What do you notice about the language? Now, Kate and I are going to role play a conversation between a call center agent and a customer. Are you ready, Kate?
I am.
Okay, so I'll be the agent and you be the customer. And the rest of you, as you're listening, think about what do you see in the language of this discussion that you might want to prepare students or trainees to be able to do. I'll begin. So it should be coming tomorrow or tomorrow.
Tomorrow?
Right.
Okay. Is there a tracking number or anything so we can track it?
Sure. 1 second, please.
Okay, sure.
Okay, you ready?
Yep.
So your tracking number is 11. It's a long number.
Okay.
Well, I'll start over. 1101.
Okay.
9008.
Let me just ask you something. The 00, are those zeros or?
Zeros.
Zeros. Okay. 008.
8223.
Wait a minute. Now there's 2 8s in a row.
Right. 2 8s in a row.
8223.
121.
121.
80.
80.
59.
59.
9.
9.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Let me just read it back to you. 1101 9008 8223 1218 0599.
That is correct, ma'am.
Okay, and that would be RPS or FedEx?
Yes, ma'am. It's RPS. Do you have the number? If not, I can give that to you.
Yeah, if you would, please.
Okay. So, what did you notice about the language in this interaction?
Right, great question. Yeah, what do you think, everybody? Let's see. Teresa says it was informal English, no complete ideas, or maybe a lot of short phrases or not complete sentences. Let's see. Talia says there's a need for a lot of clarification through the process. Fragments. Great. What else did you notice? The need to understand intonation and stress from Ganita. Clary says it wasn't very professional language. Miriam says it was informal language. Let's see. Deanna said that it was difficult for the agent to read numbers in groups. And Lamia said that agent was not very confident. Okay, so what do you think, Joe?
Well, that's very interesting. I should tell you that this is a real transcript or written down language from a telephone call between two native speakers of English. So there's no question here of difficulty with the language. The interesting thing to me is that, you know, when one person is on one end of the telephone, the other person's on the other end of the telephone, and you have these long numbers, you have to give it to people in little pieces. And so what we heard was the call center person giving part of the number and then the other person responding and then another part of the number and then again responding. So one of the things that I would certainly want to focus on if I were going to be working with training this group of people was numbers and the pronunciation of numbers. And as was pointed out, intonation and was very, very important. And also I think it was Talia who pointed out the need to clarify things, to make sure that things are clear and that the person on the other end of the phone understands what you're saying. So great answers, everybody. So
Yeah.
just to recap on using the right instruments, we talked about existing information, tests, interviews, focus groups, questionnaires, observations, and discourse analysis. So let's go back to our overview of the needs assessment process. And our next step is going to be to analyze and interpret the data. Let's look at that in greater detail. When we analyze and interpret the data, we want to start out by taking all this information that we took in and thinking about, what does it mean? We want to think about the different sources that it came from. Are those reliable sources? Do we trust them? And we want to look for patterns or trends. Maybe one person had a very strong opinion about something, but maybe that's only one person. What do the most people think about it? And we also want to bear in mind that different informants might give us different perspectives. Maybe the students might have one point of view, the teachers might have a different one. Maybe the administrators have one thought and the people who actually have to do the work have another idea. And we also want to think that with this data and analysis, who is the audience for the findings? In a larger needs assessment activity, it might be necessary to have a formal report. But if it's just you and it's a smaller situation, you probably don't need that. You can probably just take that information and use it directly in your course. The one other thought I have is, if you're in a situation where you're reporting to people who really don't know very much about language teaching, and this is common in the ESP setting, don't discount your own experience. Make sure that you are confident in your own ideas about language teaching. It's very common that people think that students should be able to learn a lot of language in a very short time, and it never works. So don't discount your own experience. So getting back to our roadmap, our next step is to think about how we can use this information to design courses. And in order to do that, I'd like to look at a framework of developing courses, which again comes from Kathleen Graves. And Graves suggests 5 steps in course development, starting with needs analysis, which we've been working on. And then once you have that information, formulating goals and objectives based on the needs of the students. After you have the goals and objectives, you'd think about the content and organization of the course, develop some materials, and think about how you would design assessments so that you are sure that students were learning what they should be. So let's look at the first step after needs analysis, which would be goals and objectives. So looking at goals and objectives in greater detail, what we want to think about would be, first of all, setting goals for the course and for students. So some overall goals, and then probably some more specific objectives and student learning outcomes. And one way that we often do that these days is using an expression like, by the end of the course, the students will be able to do this thing. So in the case of my call center trainees, it might be, by the end of the course, students will be able to use intonation fluently in order to appear polite to people on the other end of the phone. Or perhaps we would say something about the use of numbers or the ability to clarify information. The next area in course development we'll look at is content and organization. So when we think about content or organization, there are a lot of different ways that we could go. So here's my next question for you. What are some different ways to organize a course? If you were going to put a course together, how would you decide in what order things should go in that course?
Great. So what do you think, everybody? What are some ways you can organize a course? How do you think about organizing or ordering maybe a course as you're designing it? So what are some thoughts that you might have about sequencing of a course or that type of thing? So what do you think, everyone? Talia says increasing it in level of difficulty as the course goes on. Great. Let's see. Deanna says by topic. You could organize the course by topic. Rizgar says by student needs. We also are seeing by skills or by functions based on the time available. Let's see. Maybe you could break it into grammar points. Thematic organization from Fatima. And Clary also says from less difficult to more difficult. So great responses, everybody. Thanks for sharing.
Yes, those are all good things to think about when you're organizing the content of the course. Some things that you might consider in organizing the content of the course, you can see here. You might want to think about whether there's any special topic or content that needs to be included. That would be especially in the English for specific purposes area, or for example, English for academic purposes as well. And then if you're putting a course together, there are a lot of different ways that you could organize the information. You could organize it in terms of difficulty of grammatical structure. You could organize it around the vocabulary. You could organize it around topics or themes, or you could think about different types of activities that you would want to include. Well, after you've thought about the content and organization of the course, the next thing that you need to think about is developing materials. So some of the questions that you might consider when you're developing materials would be these. First of all, are there some existing materials that could be used or adapted? Or are you going to have to make new materials from scratch? If you do need to make new materials, who's going to write those materials? How long is the whole course going to be? And then based on that, how long would each unit or chapter of the course be? Is there any special content that should be included in each unit? What activities work well with these particular learners? And then when you're putting units together, you want to have some consistency so that students know what to expect, but then at the same time, you want to have a certain amount of variety. So those are some of the considerations to think about when you're developing the materials. Then the last step that Graves suggested in her outline of course development was designing assessments. So in designing assessments, some of the things that we might want to consider would be the initial needs assessments of the students, including level placement, diagnostic tests that we might give them. We might want to think about how we're going to assess student progress, and then about how we might assess the student achievement of the learning outcomes that we developed in our initial goals and objectives session. And then we'd want to think about how we might evaluate the success of the course itself. If some administrator or someone was to come to us and say, so did your students learn what they were supposed to learn? We'd like to be able to give them some justification for the course as a whole. So returning to our roadmap, we've talked about how we could use the information to design courses, and we'd like to talk just for a couple minutes about how needs assessment can support curriculum design or tailoring a existing course. So I'd like to start off by asking the question, what is a curriculum? Well, if we think about a lesson plan, the lesson plan is kind of what you do in class today, right? But what you do in class today is part of a larger course unit. It might, for example, be a small section of your overall course, or maybe a chapter in your textbook. And then that course unit is part of a larger organizational unit, which is your course syllabus, which is a description of your entire course or class from the beginning to the end. So that's the way most of us as teachers are usually thinking. We're thinking about our lesson plan, our course unit, and the course syllabus. But some people, often supervisors or administrators, have to think about curriculum. And when we use the word curriculum, usually we mean a description or a framework for an entire series of courses which all together make up a student's educational instruction. And we're, of course, usually thinking about this in terms of English language teaching. So how might a needs assessment for curriculum design be different from the needs assessment for a course? Well, we're going to use the same basic ideas, the same principles that we've been talking about today, but it's probably going to take longer because you have more content and more students and more everything to think about. It's going to involve more people because you're going to have to talk to more people who could be affected by it. It's almost certainly going to result in a formal written report. And when you put that together, you're probably going to have to bear in mind standards and regulations. Perhaps your Ministry of Education has certain guidelines and you have to make sure that you follow those. And then, of course, you're going to need a lot of different people to put that curriculum into practice. So that's a little bit about how you might apply some of these concepts of needs assessment to a larger curriculum project. But let's also look at how we might apply these concepts of needs assessment just to an existing course or class, because I know that most of you are probably regular classroom teachers. And this question was asked earlier, how can I apply these principles in a smaller way? So if you're just thinking about an existing class that you have, you're going to use a much shorter and simpler process. And your best informants are probably going to be your students. You can give your students preferences, surveys about their preferences or about their interests to learn more about that. And then maybe you can make some modest changes in your class. You can have some flexibility as far as that goes. You might, for example, want to do this at the beginning of the course, or maybe even in the middle of the course. By the end of the course, it's kind of too late to do anything different. So probably the beginning and the middle are better times. So I'd like to show you one activity that's really easy to do and that can get you some very surprisingly useful information. And I call this the clear and muddy activity. The clear and muddy activity uses the concept of the classroom exit ticket. And if you'd like to learn more about exit tickets, I think that Heather might drop something in the chat about that. So, and the idea of the exit ticket is that you give all of your students a little piece of paper and you ask them 2 questions. And this is at the very end of your class time. And then you stand by the door, and as they walk out the door, they give you that piece of paper. Or they could come up to, if you have a desk in the front, they could come up and give it to you there. So you ask them 2 questions. And the first question is this: what is one thing that's very clear to you about today's class? What's something that you felt you really understood very well? And then the second question is this: write one thing that's muddy or that's unclear or that you think you'd like to learn more about. So you ask students those 2 questions at the end of class, they write them down, and then they give them to you as they walk out the door. And then you take those pieces of paper and you look at them, and it's very interesting sometimes things that you think you've been very clear about are perhaps not as clear as you thought. So what we've talked about today are the following things. We talked about what is needs assessment, how could we gather information, how can we then use that information to design courses, and then we looked a little bit at how needs assessment could support curriculum design or tailoring an existing course. So I hope that this last definition, this simple definition of needs assessment, will stick with you. Needs assessment is figuring out what you need to teach and how you can effectively teach it. And I hope that some of the ideas that we explored today are things that you'll be able to use in your own situation to learn more about your students and what they need to know. I've got just a handful of references here, and this will be available later if you'd like to download these. There's the book by J.D. Brown, and also the excellent book by Kathleen Graves called Designing Language Courses, from which many of these ideas came. So I hope that these ideas have been helpful to you. I've enjoyed talking with you today, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe, for clearly explaining these decision points and needs-based considerations that we all need to consider when designing new courses or curricula. So thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And as usual, we're seeing lots of our participants say the same thing, talking about how thank you so much, it was great, etc. So we're so happy that you were able to present with us today, Joe, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
And as always, we want to thank our wonderful audience of excellent participants with all of your great responses, comments, ideas, questions. Thank you so much to each of you for joining us today. And we hope that you'll continue to share your ideas through social media, on our Ning, or with your viewing groups after the session ends.